Okay, right. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. We're going to start 1 minute past the hour. Gives an opportunity for people to reset and refocus there. By the way, you can participate in this webinar. We say this all the time, but I know that people want me to say this all the time, which is participate in two ways. Either you can post your comments in the chat, which is denoted by the single speech bubble. I know what you're going to say, Adrian, already. You know, I'm going to wait for you to come in on to queue on
I'm
time on
sorry.
this. Yeah, you can post your comments in the chat, and also you can post a question anonymously by or through the two speech bubbles, which are denoted in the toolbar that you've got at the top or the bottom of your screen, and you can post a question to our panelists that way round. And guess what, Adrian? What can you do?
You can get a copy of the slides. I promise. You don't need to ask.
As you can
Send them
tell,
to you.
audience, we have practiced this webinar time and time again on this set. So this webinar has proved exceptionally popular as our first webinar of the year at Elephants Don't Forget. I'm delighted to be joined together at the hip on this webinar with our colleagues from Ocorian and Michael Lawrence and Mark Spiers in this, proving that Consumer Duty is certainly just as popular as Love Island. And I know that from people who have, yes, you can raise your hand, but unfortunately won't be able to ask it. So drop that in the comments if you would do. But proving that obviously that evidence around Consumer Duty is far more appealing than who's in and who's out on a Love Island is much more appealing. And as Adrian said, you get a copy of the slides and a copy of the recording there afterwards there. We'll ask you to invite you to participate in our webinars, in our polls throughout this session there. And also you get the opportunity to signing up to Ocorian's thought leadership after the webinar there. And this is us. Yeah, we're going to unpack a number of issues and there with colleagues at Ocorian, managing partner Mark Spiers and Michael Lawrence, who's the consultancy lead at Ocorian, as well as our co-founder and chairman, Adrian Harvey of Elephants Don't Forget as well there. And we're going to be discussing these key themes here, which you see listed on the screen there. Michael, tell us, why has this webinar in particular raised such interest or piqued such interest in individuals? And what are we doing that perhaps firms might be slightly apprehensive of getting wrong in 2026?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I think, the regulator, the FCA, is going through a bit of a recalibration of its strategy in the last year. We see this focus on growth and maybe a recalibration of what it's going to look like in terms of the other and wider supervisory focus areas. But I suppose the one thing that's key is that focus on customer outcomes remains kind of undiminished. And so, undiminished, that's the word I was looking for. And so, I think, trying to understand what that looks like, both through the lens of consumer duty outcomes, but also those broader cultural and kind of conduct metrics. I think bringing those three things together is never a bad thing. And so hopefully we can get into what that looks like and what the good and the bad and the ugly look like in that space.
And Adrian, when we look at evidence and culture and approaches to learning and outcomes, they're inextricably linked. We'll land that throughout the webinar, but those aren't to be taken in isolation, are they?
No, I think we've got lots of evidence in this webinar around where learning and culture is completely connected to good customer outcomes. I'm slightly distracted. Everyone can hear. I got one or two attendees can't hear, so I think everyone else can hear as it happens. So apologies if the two can't.
Good. So we want to set the scene for this webinar, and we were graced by the presence of Jonathan Pearson, who's head of department at consumer policy and outcomes at the FCA at a recent Elephants Don't Forget event in November of last year. And in that, he shared this presentation, from implementation to impact, the next chapter for consumer duty. And we have deliberately and intentionally landed many of his key points from that session into framing this webinar and this discussion topic, so and to a wider audience. And I think that's critical, because whilst one could argue that is there something new here or is there something different here, I think it's drilling down on key messages that many firms have actually grappled with and try to understand in 2025 and preceding that. There, two questions come out from that, Mark, there that firms are being expected to obviously answer. Can you demonstrate that your culture supports your people in making decisions that genuinely benefit consumers? And number two, can you demonstrate that there is a continuous culture of improvement in your firm? How effective are firms actually addressing those and answering those to the expectation and the satisfaction of the FCA?
So I think the first question is one of the ones that's really not troubling firms, but one isn't, you're in a bit of a cleft stick, aren't you? The markets aren't going to be fantastic probably in 2026. We've seen, if you're on the wealth side, for instance, great market improvements over 2025, despite headwinds. But there's also pressure on business model. You have some real changes in shareholders. So if you think about the wealth industry consolidating, and what are the drivers that the new shareholders are looking for? It's shareholder value, shareholder value, shareholder value. So how do I, as a board or as a management team, balance shareholder value with, one of the sort of four pillars of the FCA's cultural drivers, purpose? How do I balance that maximizing shareholder value with consumer outcomes? We do see firms are under pressure to reduce cost, to increase revenue, particularly annuity revenue or recurring revenue. And how do you balance those two things? Really is where the rubber meets the road. I was going to go on to leadership, so rudders as well. How do you demonstrate that you do rather than just say? That's the second sort of cultural driver, leadership. And really that's what the FCA is probably driving at here for those boards and senior managers is don't just say it, do it. But you've got all these other pressures behind you from shareholders, from people who've lent you risk capital to go into to set up your firm, to grow your firm, whatever. And how do you square those circles? And really that's where I'm seeing a lot of firms struggle a little bit. And we've seen that in a couple of the issues that have come out, particularly say in the wealth side. But I'm sure we'll get on to people like the payments firms and fraud and things like that during this this webinar.
And Adrian, and certainly, do you see that there is still an Achilles heels for many organisations in their approach to learning? While the regulator, and Jonathan has highlighted in his presentation the importance of learning and your approach to training, do you think that still is a bear trap for companies or firms just walking straight into without knowingly thinking that there's an issue or challenge there?
I think that by far the majority of firms in the market treat workplace training as a proxy for competence. The fact that they've done it, therefore it's done, we've achieved the outcome that's required. And that's absolutely not the case. Workplace training is essential, but it is just one component of employee competence. And we'll get on to why competence is important. The regulator, I think, has perhaps got to the end of its leash on tick box training and competence, and is actually now calling out competence as the required outcome, and the training bit is just a means to getting to that competence. It is not a proxy.
Can I jump in here, Felix? I think it's a really interesting thing for me in the sense that, these questions posed by the FCA, well, that comes alive for firms, obviously through the BAU kind of governance of the firm. But each year within the kind of Consumer Duty Board report, there needs to be a kind of an accounting of the outcomes that have been delivered that year, the risks and any, issues that have come through. And then also, I think the kind of root cause analysis of why those things happened. And to Adrian's point, if you have had, something go wrong or out of killed with what you expected, these things happen, but did you learn from it? And to the extent that it wasn't down to, your business model, but it was down to the individuals, well, what can you do differently in terms of their training, their competence, so that you can put yourself in a better position to get it right next time? And I think that kind of evidence is what the FCA is looking for in that space.
So, we've decided the FCA has said that there is a marked shift, and on the left-hand side, we've got many of the things that organisations have worked tirelessly hard since Consumer Duty's inception. Michael, there, frameworks, policy, compliance, and implementation. But there is still a disconnect, isn't there, on the right-hand side, where are the FCA evidencing or seeing evidence of the behaviours or appropriate improved outcomes, better behaviours, and better decisions, and therefore leading to better outcomes? Is there still that disconnect where you feel that the FCA is going to drill down on quite hard in 2026?
Yeah, I think so. I think, and I've certainly looked at a lot of firms' board reports. And one of the things I've seen, and I think the FCA references as well in its kind of feedback in this space, is that in a lot of those reports, in the narratives about outcomes, you've got a lot of, material on the things that firms have done. We've done this, we've amended this process, this procedure, but without then the so what of it. So how can we then determine whether those changes that we've made are actually moving the dial? So it's not that those things being done are a bad thing. Of course they're not. These are kind of bits of evidence that you can say, look, we're taking this seriously. We've made some changes, but you then need to go the step further, saying, and because of that, this is what's happened as a result. And, if you made a change and the right thing doesn't happen, well, we've looked into it and we're kind of recalibrating what we do to try and get it right next time. So I think it's that point about outcomes and your bottom line there on implementation to embedding. That embedding bit is the stubborn bit. And I think the FCA will cut firms a little bit of slack here. They know this is a journey, particularly in some sectors where, product governance and focus on customer outcomes has been less well evolved than others. But we're now at the point, this year will be 3 years on from the duty, where I think those firms that are laggards will see some increased challenge.
And one of the things that we want to get a measure of where you are in your approach to consumer duty is by answering this poll question here, which is completely anonymous, multi-choice answers, please, if you would do. In your firm, where do you see the biggest conduct and cultural risk to deliver good consumer duty outcomes in 2026? So in your firm, where do you see the biggest conduct and culture risk to delivering good customer outcomes there? Interested to see, Adrian, there, where do you think the hard to spot risks are still in firms that you are working with?
I think Mark touched on it earlier. I've got policies and procedures. All of it looks great and it's fine, but how do I prove or evidence that these policies and procedures occur on a day-to-day basis? So I like this first point, culture exists on paper. Yeah. So I think that's a challenge for firms. It's a challenge for firms have done all the hard, what I call heavy lifting. They've done the desk-based stuff. They've got all the policies, procedures, product stuff. It's all been done. Now they've got to live it. And we've got evidence that all of that stuff is translating into day-to-day business as usual. I think that is proving a real challenge. That's why we've had so many people register for this webinar.
And Mark, this doesn't just speak about just your approach to consumer duty, isn't it? It's wider, isn't it?
Yeah. So, I mean, the culture piece is that thing that underlies everything. And I think it goes to, okay, do we have we as a result of this, changed our product, turned
Mm.
down business. I mean, there would be a thing, right? Turn down revenue. Look at something and say, no, that doesn't actually jive with our culture, so we're going to turn it down.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
looking at these results, there's a couple of clear winners. I don't know whether
Mm.
everybody was anchored by it being first and Adrian's discussion there, but
Leading
that
the witness.
exists on paper but doesn't consistently shape day-to-day decisions. That's all about, okay, do we support people who've got poor culture? Do we reward them
Mm.
even though, I don't know, they're a bully? Because they're a great salesperson or a great advisor with customers, but actually within the firm they're a bit of a malign influence, but do they always get the bonus and do they always do really well? That sort of question, which sounds really negative in a way, turn
Mm.
down revenue, don't do this, but actually it all points then to getting better outcomes in the end.
And the other one that I
Well,
saw,
yeah. Sorry, go on, Michael. I
it
mean,
was
this
like
is
number
fascinating. We could
seven.
spend we could spend
Yeah, yeah.
20 minutes on this. I mean, literally, go on, go on.
No, I was going to say on the other one I saw was number seven. I think that was the second one about not articulating what good looks like, because I think the first one is like you've articulated it, but then you don't live up to it. So the kind of say do gap. But I think in some firms this is really hard. Like in the absence of a clear articulation that this is okay, this might be okay, and this clearly isn't okay. Whether you do that as a RAG rating or whatever. I think it can allow kind of like misconduct and poor culture to kind of exist in plain sight. And so I think one of the things where I'm seeing the better firms get to is, although it's hard, articulating, okay, we think this is a poor or an indifferent outcome. We're going to enshrine it into my mind. We might not get it right first time, and we're going to monitor it, and then we might recalibrate it down the line. But it's creating those kind of action points, those discussion points, which is then informing like better discussions.
Mm. And Adrian, 19%. I mean, that's or nearly 20% of firms who responded to this poll said that leadership don't basically follow through or reinforce good outcomes. Well, you're not going to get a good culture if it's not, tone from the top is not there.
This comes up consistently. Last year, almost every webinar we ran, the tone from the top and the complaint from those charged with ensuring that firms remained on the right side of the law, there was a big disconnect. The tone from the top is not where we need it to be. And I think a good example, and Michael and Mark will see it, is how many firms subbed the production of the board report as a one-off exercise to somebody somewhere in the organisation. There you go, Tarquin, knock up a board report, file that, and then we can get on with business. I'm sort of hoping that a lot of the people on this webinar are slightly more better informed and more professional, but a lot of firms certainly took that approach.
Let's look at our second poll question as a follow-up, because I think this will be even more interesting and pique the interest of our panelists even more, which is, how are you currently evidencing a strong consumer duty culture in your firm? So how are you evidencing a strong consumer duty culture in your firm? Are we sometimes, sorry, I should say, Michael, Mark, M&M, I keep saying that, M&M there. So where do firms commonly overestimate, you think, their strength or their approach to consumer duty there? Don't say all, please.
I think what we've seen in the last year or so, as we've been talking to clients, is the customer understanding piece is still really interesting. I brought it up possibly on one of these, I can't remember, but my wife has a SIP with a well-known provider through her workplace, and gets, I'd say, a wodge of documents like this with every single performance review or valuation. Doesn't read it, doesn't particularly care. She cares about the number on the front, and the drivers of performance and why she's underperforming the market, which they don't tell her in the product that she has, right? And that's the sort of place where I think, and I've spoken to that firm, and they think they're doing a really good job. And I've pointed this out several times as, here's a focus group of one, I know, but here you are. And so I think people really do need to start really thinking about what their customers want to know. And it's going to be awkward, right? If you're underperforming the market,
Yeah.
albeit with a cheap marketplace, a workplace pension, then that's an awkward conversation. But that's what the consumer really wants to know. What am I going to get at the end of this?
Mm. Mm. Michael, thoughts on our poll? The lead answer here is that we combine cultural metrics with some outcome testing and MI around that, and then we rely mainly on policies, training, completion, and engagement surveys. Obviously, Adrian hasn't passed out yet, so he's not that irate about the feedback there. But really, is that how we're measuring culture and measuring your approach to consumer duty?
Look, I think with this, you can go, too far down the kind of granular MI path. So I think it's fine. And I think, the FCA endorses the idea that, there's a wide variety of inputs into this. Some of them will be kind of quantitative, the kind of regular MI, not just on the customer outcomes, but on your kind of governance, your breaches, your kind of HR outputs. All those are good things. But then also bringing in the more qualitative bits of MI, and that could be the fact that you do a review of topic X like once a year, or you've had an internal audit review of something, or even you've got some anecdotal stuff coming through from your customer calls or stuff themes in your complaints. And the key point, I think, is that all of that is good stuff. It's about putting it in the right bucket, relaying it through to those kind of key cultural drivers, those key outcomes drivers, and making sense of it. And that last thing, the making sense of it, is one of the areas where I think it requires a bit more kind of investment of time, effort, and the old grey matter, because getting a wedge of data is not always getting lots of insights. And I think looking across all of it and working out the so what is one of the key things that the better firms do well.
Are you concerned, Adrian, on this on the poll result there where it's got 12% unsure? We haven't tested this in a structured way. Your evidence of a strong consumer duty culture. Is that?
Well done for being honest and perhaps realistic, because I'm slightly curious as to how these other firms are measuring culture. 1, 2, how they know it's good. Where's their yardstick? What are they comparing it against? And what's the culture measure say? Like 7 out of 10? So to what extent does this cultural measurement, is it meaningful, or is it just a data point? So how do you really know? And there seems to be quite a lot of reliance on we're measuring it and we're doing this and we're doing that. Okay. I'd like to understand that. So my point would be, I think that looks like a very realistic and perhaps starkly honest response by a number of attendees.
Good. And we'll unpack that in a bit more detail later on in this webinar. So 2 points that you wanted to flag, Michael, there is that if we widen the discussion out of just measuring and monitoring culture, and I think it was highlighted in the first poll, the issue of fair value. And Mark, you alluded to with your anecdote about your wife's SIPs on consumer understanding. Talk to us about some key evidence points that would demonstrate a firm's robust culture, that they can actually give that to the regulator and say, we're on it.
Sure. I mean, in terms of fair value, sometimes I've seen some firms, really wrestling with these quite hard to define questions, like how do you put a price on peace of mind, But I think in many areas there are some much kind of simpler and more straightforward steps that firms can take to put themselves in a good position to do a decent fair value assessment that is hopefully, will stand up to kind of regulatory scrutiny. So I think the first thing is, being clear about what the charges are in reality. So everyone's got a charging model, and you'll have an idea, I hope, about how that applies to different groups. It might be that it's uniform, everyone pays the same. It might be that different groups pay different things. That's your hypothesis. But then you'll have data in arrears on what the reality is. Okay, so I thought charges were going to be X. For customers, actually, there's a range of outcomes. And we've seen some really, eye-opening and really helpful outputs from that analysis in firms where they've worked out a couple of things. I mean, the rump of clients are in the middle where they're expected, but they've got a significant proportion at one end of the distribution who they're notionally undercharging. That's a question of kind of commerciality. Why is it? Is it discounting run a mark? Is it a family-oriented scheme? Who knows? But at least they got into talking about it. But at the other end, they had a subset of customers who were paying 2-3 times what they expected. That's a regulatory risk, potentially, that they looked into and then they intervened and fixed it. That's a key thing. But I think it's on that, it's really easy to go down to this idea of fair value being a race to the bottom on price. It isn't, because it's price versus benefit. So the next bit then is, well, what is it that my product or service does for clients, and are they getting those things? And tracking that, calls made to clients, reports delivered, suitability changes made, whatever it is. I think if you can bring those two together, the hypothesis and the reality of charge and benefit, you're in a really good position then to evidence your conclusions. And whilst you might also go to the customer, to end where we began, to find out their views and what price you put on peace of mind, you've got that as part of a broader, more grounded evidence set to justify your approach.
And Mark, still gaps in consumer support and products and services that firms should be very aware of coming into 2026?
Yeah, and actually, I think I'll pick up on one of the questions in the stream here. Josh put on one about dealing with small and large clients and the fairness between the two. And of course, you can have different propositions for different size clients in terms of you can say, well, look, if in fees term you pay this and they pay that. So you need to be able to just demonstrate, though, the value from those fees that they pay. So look at the sort of consumer support piece. You probably wouldn't want to say, well, if you bring me £1 million versus you who bring me 10,000, then I'm going to answer you in 3 rings and you in, well, next month sometime. If you're lucky, you'll go through to something else. And I think that's where firms struggle in where do the boundaries lie between those service standards. All firms do really have different products for different size clients, but how do I manage the client life cycle between all of those and demonstrate that for the £10 that X is paying versus the £1,000 that Y is paying, they're both still getting fair value and the outcomes are consistent. And this piece about the end-to-end product oversight, there is nothing new in product governance. Firms have always been required to think about their products across a life cycle, and it has always been a problem that firms concentrate on the going into it, because that's the exciting bit, and we're planning and it's going to be successful and we're going to earn lots of money and all of our clients are going to be seriously happy with this new proposition. But once it's been in for a year, all that excitement starts to dissipate, and particularly if it hasn't, dare I say it, been quite as successful as everybody thought it might be, then people aren't necessarily looking at it with a really sort of forensic lens. And
Can I jump in there, Mark? Because I think I've got an interesting example around financial advisors' ongoing services. Unsurprisingly, this was one of the areas that the FCA chose to look at first in the advice sector, which is basically, firms levying an ongoing fee to deliver an ongoing service. And I think the FCA was focused not on, was that fee itself fair value, but a much simpler metric. Did the customers get what they paid for? And so that was its focus. That great value, regular advice to recalibrate what you're getting relative to your needs, relative to the performance of your body. Great, but it needs to be delivered. And I think what it found that a number of firms, they weren't tracking it effectively. They didn't know when services hadn't been delivered. And they put a challenge out to the firms involved to say, look, if you're charging people for something, but they're not delivering it, you need to check in and make sure either, number one, that you're delivering it as promised, or number two, if you or the client can't live up to the engagement that you're planning, then maybe that service isn't the right thing for them. And I think that kind of intervention we could easily see in some other sectors as well.
Good shout there. And when we drill down into it, and the FCA, Adrian, is looking for day-to-day evidence of training and competency, delivering good and effective outcomes. And you raised the point here, point number one, strengthening the frontline resilience. Unpack that for us in a bit more detail, because I think you landed a few aha moments prior to the webinar.
So the data would suggest 27% of the working population in the UK are Gen Z. I would suggest that frontline contact center environments are overrepresented with Gen Z employees. I think it's probably more likely 50%. Of the Gen Z population, 47% of this part of society are presenting with mental health challenges. So whilst the regulator and the firms look to their customers and test them for vulnerability and ensure that those customers then receive fair outcomes despite their vulnerabilities, what support are these firms, these employers, people on this webinar, giving their employees, particularly when potentially half of one significant portion of those employees are suffering mental health or wellbeing challenges? And what I know from speaking with a number of our customers who have expressed disappointment that they've invested in wellbeing type support to help their employees be more resilient, and then bemoan the fact that the employees don't actually use these support tools. So there is a void here. There is a clear and present challenge. The workforce is growing. Gen Z is becoming a bit funny enough, is becoming ever an increasingly large percentage of the workforce. There is a responsibility. There is a genuine, human responsibility beyond consumer duty. There is a duty, human one, for firms to help and support their employees in the same way that they might choose to help and support vulnerable customers, perhaps different ways.
And you're not going to get one without the other. Is there a challenge, though, that, how do we get to that stage where you get an effective and an efficient workforce that is, high in delivering, who are content within themselves and therefore ready to deal with some very challenging issues that people do have, that they are being presented with?
Every management book at the airport will answer that question for you, Philip. I think that the answer to the question
in Nassau in the Bahamas,
you need to measure it. You need to have one point in time measurement. We're going to have an annual employee survey. It's like 1970s. So you should be continually assessing this. You should be monitoring on an ongoing basis competence and well-being and culture. The regulator said it at our client event. You do need to be measuring this more than one and done. You have to change your mindset. It needs to be a continual assessment thing. If you're not measuring it, how can you don't know where you stand, and therefore you don't know if you need to take action or where you need to take action. So the first thing, you need to measure it.
Okay, Michael, when we're still focusing on the people, though, we also are looking at how incentives shape behaviours here. And that's critical, that shift not only comes in stopping rewarding productivity, but rewarding based upon good outcomes as well. Are firms still struggling with that? Would you see that there's an issue, or are firms getting on top of that?
I think a lot of firms have been in the space of trying to balance the two for a while. They're not mutually exclusive, and you have that kind of, the balanced scorecard. Well, you've got those really important productivity measures. Let's not shy away from those. It's really good to kind of measure the output of people as a kind of key input into how they are, performance managed and rewarded. But then it's about balancing that with wider criteria, looking at the quality of it, whether it's a customer facing quality in terms of the quality of the advice that you're delivering, or an internal one, whether if you're in the kind of compliance area, and the quality of the work that you're conducting, and how you follow through on the issues that you've done. So I don't think it's a new thing. I think the thing for me, I suppose supercharged by the duty, is just doing a bit of a housekeeping on those quality measures to make sure that they've been kind of brought up to date. And as Mark said, if you're getting it right, you're looking at the various dimensions of how the different activities that different staff do flow through into what customers get. Yes, it's suitability, but it's also the quality of communications. It's also the quality of customer support. And the firms that are doing this well have done a bit of housekeeping. They've updated that. They've got decent data on it. And that data doesn't always have to be, massively quantitative. It can be, of course, but in smaller firms, just having other mechanisms to bring back the kind of collected learnings from, performance management meetings, to look at the key themes and then think about what you might need to do. There's different strokes for different strokes, and the FCA's, I think, been fairly upfront at saying, the big firm, the big bang, versus the small 1 or 2 person firms. It doesn't expect the same rigor in terms of data, but it expects the same rigor in terms of focus.
And just quickly on this one, Mark, point number 4. Yeah, it's not a tick box or compliance submission, the board report there. There should be a annual ongoing evidence, shouldn't there, that culture is improving within the firm?
Yeah, I think Michael picked this up earlier, but it's really a state of the nation address, isn't it? It's a sort of it's not just, oh yes, we've issued this policy, done that, etc., etc. But it really does start to get to the heart of, are we achieving our purpose? What, and I think that also, just picking up on something that Adrian said earlier about the change in the workforce and trying to give people something to coalesce around. I really do think that purpose piece is super important within the financial services industry. A lot of people, it's not quite like politics, people go into it to make a difference, but and then it all goes horribly wrong. But you get this piece where most of us have gone in to make a difference. We want to solve people's problems. I want to help people be richer, have a good retirement, be protected if their home is affected by Storm Chandra, etc., etc. And really, that's the purposeful part of financial services, and it's really thinking about how we as boards and senior managers can really bring us back to thinking about our purpose, and everybody striving towards that purpose. And my previous shareholder value versus customer outcomes, still, it's shareholder value versus purpose. Hopefully they're both aligned, but you never know. Sometimes they're not.
Yeah, sometimes they're not. Drill down on for us. What's making you laugh, Adrian?
Someone asked if they were going to get copied of slides, inevitably.
Okay, right. Let's get back to the main event then. So learning behaviours and outcomes. It's worth reinforcing and doubling down on this point, because I think that the whole evidential bar has been raised, hasn't it, through what Jonathan at the FCA was saying, and also what Michael and Mark are saying. The evidence bar, in terms of not just doing training for the training's sake, but actually seeing a positive and productive outcome, is where it lands now. How are firms approaching that differently under consumer duty than perhaps before the duty actually landed with financial services institutions?
Is that aimed at me?
Yeah.
Good. So, so yes, I think firms are taking different approaches. I'm going to answer the question a different way, and it's more that my sort of look in the mirror type answer. If you look at how firms outside of financial services might train a new to sector electrician, and the vocational ongoing continual assessment and support at all levels, mental health, everything. You look at the investment and ensuring that competence is achieved and maintained and exam tested, by the way, versus the effort put into a similar aged individual joining the financial services sector. There is absolutely no contest. The electrician is
That's
going to
true.
be
That's very
a
true.
competent electrician. The individual joining a financial services firm is likely to be able to tick some boxes and show a sea of green. You would never let them near any sort of electrical problem contextually or in parallel. So, why is it that one sector genuinely invests? Because when they get it wrong, the consequences are very, very serious. Yeah. But equally, when a financial services firm gets it wrong, the consequences are very, very serious.
Mm.
There's a void, a huge void. And I think as a sector, we can learn from other sectors and the
Mm.
importance and investment that they place in the development of youth coming into their sector.
I like that analogy. I do. And I think it actually drills down into our next point on outcomes monitoring, Michael, and that perhaps there's a danger of measuring what's easy than what's actually matters.
Yeah, definitely. So it comes back to something we've touched on a couple of times around, what do we think good and bad looks like? Then what data do we have? How does that map to it? And what data don't we have? And could we get it? And I think within that, then you say, well, I've got this data, I need to get the other. Maybe I'll try and fill that in where practical. If not, maybe I can backfill it through some other things. We can do a periodic review where we'll dip sample it. We can get some anecdotal stuff in from these people. So I think with all this stuff, start with the ideal and then work back to what's practical. And I think the FCA's been clear that, it knows that firms won't have all of this from the get-go, but it expects, key gaps to be closed. And I think, as I said, as we approach 3 years in, I think if you still haven't got a solution to your key gaps, you could be, ripe for potential challenge, particularly through the FCA's data-led work.
Mm.
But I think if you're asking the right questions, you're then filling it with a mixture of the different types of data, and you're able to articulate that versus, we think this is a good outcome, we think this is poor, and here's how we stack that up. You should be in a good place. The one thing that I do see in, MI packs and sometimes in board reports, though, is almost like a kind of a wall of data and not enough analysis. And there's almost an assumption that you put that to whatever clever senior management and they're going to be able to intuit it. And look, some very clever senior management, there might be something they're really able to do quite easily. But I think in the better firms, they've added a bit of extra resource to analyze the data and to pull out the so what. And it could be conjecture, it could be a hypothesis for the senior management to challenge, but it's there. This is what we think. Do you agree? If not, why not? And I think that's where the better firms are getting to better outcomes, better insight into their issues more quickly.
I want to unpack this about data to both Adrian and yourself, Mark. Is there a danger that the C-suite get just swamped with data and they can't see the wood from the trees on this, or is there a mechanism that as Michael has said on that the fourth bullet point on what this really means? He's talked about within tolerance versus outside tolerance. There are there any kind of okay, we're awash with data, we just don't know which to choose as a metric, as a compass bearing to actually walk off, because of that sea of data that we're now swamped in. And is that a real issue, a real challenge?
Oh, and I think when you see the size of some board packs, and not just the report, but the report is often part of a a meeting that might have 180 pages in it, and in there you've got your consumer duty board report as well, which has a whole load of green all over it, as Adrian was saying. People are good at getting to green. And to actually then drill down into what needs fixing is pretty difficult. I think though, if you're just waiting for a report to go to the board, then that's not really the outcome that the FCA is looking for here. Continual assurance is something that everybody should be striving for. I know it's one of those sort of nirvana concepts that everybody says they're striving for, and no one quite manages to get there. But sort of little and often is a lot better, I think, than everything once, and once a year. So focuses intra-year, I think, are probably quite useful.
Mm.
But that idea of what can we get on an ongoing, continual basis that's going to allow us to course correct within the year, so much better than waiting till the end of the year, obviously.
Yeah, well said, well said. Adrian, from your perspective, what does continuous improvement look like from a learning perspective?
Yes. So if you take it the concept of continuous improvement, you really should be continually assessing the competence of your employees. Otherwise, it's not continuous improvement, it's single point in time, annual or biannual, improvement. So if what you are trying to improve has a high employee influence factor, if it's a KPI that is related to your employees, you should be measuring employee competence on an ongoing basis and then correlating that to your desired improvement. Otherwise, it's not continuous improvement.
Yeah, and no, it isn't. And when you look at continuous improvement, you're looking at, as you've highlighted on the screen, 3 points there. Training alone doesn't equal competence there. Unpack that for us, because I think that people would say we've done our training and therefore, ergo, we think our people are competent. No.
I think a lot of firms historically have been seduced by a sort of race to the bottom for lowest cost to train, fastest time to train these people. And, it doesn't matter whether it's computer-based training, whatever it may be. But I think a lot of firms along the way have lost sight of what the objective of the exercise is. The object is not training. The object is that you get a competent, well-balanced, well-supported, resilient employee who's capable, able, and willing to ensure your customers get great outcomes. I'm not entirely sure a lot of the training and competency practices that I see now as default achieve that outcome. They certainly achieve low-cost, quick training.
But it's possible to get it right. I think we see examples where, on top of whatever core training is, with its limitations, I think as you've pointed out, there's other, intra-month, intra-week, moments of truth on key themes that are able to be identified, the lessons synthesized, I got my teeth in, and shared. So it's not, as you say, one and done every year, but that's quite effortful, I think, to do those other things, to bring them out, to work out what's right, to then articulate them in a way to staff where the implication for them is clear. But I have seen good firms doing that. So there's a path through this, but it's hard and effortful, I think, to get it really well done.
Yeah, and just going back to that, the question we asked at the start, how does your culture support your people in making decisions? And I've said this before, you train monkeys and you educate people. The consumer duty is not tick box, right? So it can't be a rote training, do this and therefore this will happen. You have to be able to think around the problem and not just on a bit by bit basis. So yeah, that's where I'd really encourage people to think about. Adrian, when you were talking about the low cost options, well, yeah, the low cost options are great, but think about the blended learning that you can do with, yes, the sheep dip low cost, but also then top ups with a bit more sort of in-depth, a bit more discursive education rather than just rote training.
I don't think you need to spend a lot of money. I just think you need to change your mindset.
Mm.
Yeah. So, the
Mm.
mindset that says one and done is just completely wrong. Yeah. So, I mean, we have a solution that does it every day, right? And we got plenty of customers, tier one brands in many of the sectors on this webinar, yeah, who have taken the decision to move away from one and done and move to a continual assessment and help their employees obtain optimal competence. So yes, and there are many other ways that you can augment that, but ultimately you need to do it on a daily basis.
And
I
can I just
think
add
it's
one
really
quick thing? Oh, go on. Sorry.
no, I think it's really big what the FCA has basically said there, and I highlighted it with my amazing annotation there. That competency under the duty is not a one-off achievement, and I think it's the first time I've seen for a long time. Yeah, first time. Yeah, first time I think I've seen a presentation from the FCA saying, "Look, no, that's not a good enough. Just enough is not good enough." And I think that if firms walked away from this webinar thinking, "Oh, okay, right, can we reassess and review our approach to learning?" Because ergo that actually will actually impact on the way that customer outcomes are delivered in our firm in 2026. That's not a bad heads up to actually look at that. And going back to your point, Mark, dropping that in the board report that we've had a full drains up approach to learning and training development of our people. And actually, we recognize that there are these gaps, and this is how we're closing those gaps as well, evidenced by the data behind it, qualitative as well as quantitative there. Sorry, Michael, go on.
No, I was just going to add a bit about just making sure that you get the basics right as well. So we were doing a kind of review of a largest firm's approach to vulnerable clients, and it had some kind of semi-regular training, testing kind of competency. And it showed that in a certain area, certain teams, like, fairly consistently low scores. And yet, I think it was slightly slow to react to that. So with all this stuff, you need, there's no harm in the sheep dip, and to Adrian's point, you can sheep dip as frequent as you want, but ultimately, why you're using that training, you're using to kind of confirm learning, to identify issues and then act upon them. And I think those results going to the right people, what do we need to do different here? We're going to take that action. We're going to do it reasonably promptly. Those are the basics, I think, that you can, get right, separate to the difficult decision of what exactly does an amazing training do. There are some basics here that if you find an issue, is it seen by the right people? Is action taken? I think we can sometimes forget those core principles as well.
And so are we looking at this new learning reality, Adrian? May not be new for you because you've been doing it for 10 years with elephants, don't forget, but a new learning reality which is going to therefore define cultural change within many organizations.
Go back to my electrician. What I know is that young individual is going to come out of that training, yeah, as a competent individual. Yeah. I think the regulator is being increasingly clear. What's required is competent employees in this sector. And the time-worn model of one and done, tick the box and hope that Adrian picks up the skills on the way, despite the fact he's working from home half the week, it is inappropriate. It's inappropriate. And more firms are picking it up, right? And the regulator's on the case. The right answer is firms need to support employees. And it's more than just the competence to do the job. It needs to be around the resilience. And I keep coming back to this well-being and this component of supporting your staff as well as your vulnerable customers.
So crystal ball time, Michael and Mark and Adrian there, fingers on buzzers. In terms of what are you looking for, or what you think the FCA is looking for with their supervisory lens over the next 11 and a half months then? what are you feeling and thinking that SMF holders on this webinar might be wise to look at in greater amount of details? Mark.
So I'm going to have a shout out for financial crime. And the reason I'm going to say that is not only because it's deeply selfish, but also because it is an area that the FCA has put as a non-negotiable, and it goes also into the consumer duty and culture and conduct space. So, we are seeing continual interaction with and thank you for the heart who have put that one. Brilliant.
I heart financial crime.
I heart financial crime, exactly, anti-financial crime. So we're looking at the highest levels of fraud ever. That does affect consumers, and whether the firm eventually stumps up the money or not, it involves, emotional distress. It involves accounts being blocked. It involves time and effort on your part to say, "Oh, what's this transaction? I didn't authorize that." So I think that's an area that the FCA is not going to step away from, and it talks to culture, conduct, and it bleeds into that consumer duty piece around how consumers interact with your products and services and what value you give them.
Michael?
Yeah, so +1 to what Mark said. I was out with the FCA the other day. The words they used were unwavering focus on financial crime. And they also added another adjective to assertive action. They said very assertive action. So I think, within a period where I think there's been a kind of regulatory recalibration in terms of kind of supervisory intensity, financial crime, client assets, vulnerability, high risk investments. These are the kinds of things that are the non-negotiables, as Mark said. But I'd raise a few others. There are still some cross-sectoral consumer duty projects that are ongoing. And interestingly, and coincidentally, given the topic of this webinar, we got a message from one of our clients recently. They've been included in a cross-sectoral consumer duty review of outcomes monitoring. So that's, I think for the firms involved, you should have got your letter by now. But the FCA is not going away on this. And it was, show us your board reports, show us your MI. We're going to have a look and see what you're up to. And there's a few other, cross-sectoral consumer duty projects as well. I think there's one on consumer understanding. So yes, the supervisory intensity in some areas turned down, but in other areas, firms are wise to kind of keep focus. And the final thing that I'd say, in some sectors, they're really upping the data-led supervision. So going out with new, fairly wide-ranging data requests, and then using that to identify either high-risk or outlier firms for further questioning. And it might be you're a great outlier. Everyone else is marching the wrong way. You're marching the right way, but you're going to be asked about it, and so you need to have and be able to have a good response when they come.
And in terms of evidencing your approach to culture under consumer duty, there's going to be much more of a forensic approach by the regulator, Adrian, to do that. But you'll be delighted to know, as the audience, that there's tools and techniques that you can use to address those. Tell us more.
Yes, indeed. I don't like making these big sales pitch things on our webinars. That's not the purpose of the webinar. But ultimately, going to the previous slide, I think the focus is cause and effect. And I think the regulator is going to want to see firms evidence the actions they're taking are having an effect. Yeah, a positive effect. Yeah, so I'm doing this, and I'm training my people, and this is getting a better outcome here. That is a challenge for firms to do manually. We've automated that and powered it up with AI, and it also gives you the opportunity to benchmark against your peers, which you may find useful in terms of how am I doing? Am I an outlier or in the pack?
Brilliant. Okay. And one of the things that we also want to do is invite you to actually hear and understand key issues that are pertaining to your organization. So we've actually looked at a number of different issues that you can follow up on and you can obviously populate on in terms of like topic areas that you would like Ocorian and ourselves to actually address in the future there. And we've asked you to rank those in terms of like highest priority to lowest priority on a number of issues that we'd like to cover up in follow-up webinars based upon the popularity of this webinar there. And you can have a look at that right now. This will give us a steer about what the issues are impacting and affecting yourselves as organizations, as well as heads and leaders of compliance and risk functions within your organizations. And I know that there's 1.5 minutes left to actually cover off any questions that you see individuals might have. Mark, Michael and Adrian, do you see any questions that one would actually like to answer straight from the get-go, apart from getting another heart-shaped sign for financial?
I was just looking at anonymous attendee has asked for, with the high uptakes of AI bots and process automation, and that's now flicked off my screen, so I can't read it. How does an organisation ensure that customers are not dropped from consumer duty by carte blanche AI process? I think this is a really good question. I really do. And
good question.
It's a brilliant question. I was halfway through saying it's a really, really good question. And then it's easier for me to talk about it. My prediction is the regulator, firstly, is already attuned to this as a risk. And I would not be at all surprised if we didn't see the regulator double down in this area and start focusing and asking for evidence that consumers, aren't just being corralled by a bot into an outcome that in reality does not suit my circumstances. And whilst I chair an AI firm, I am acutely aware of how poor AI can be at drawing conclusions.
There you go.
Well, I tell you what, ask ChatGPT a simple question about living in a particular town and ask it for advice. Just any town, just try it. It's comical.
Right.
You can't draw conclusions. So very good question. Watch your space. I think the regulator can double down on it.
You get an opportunity to experience all the services and all the features and all the benefits of our insight papers by accessing our range of papers. You'll see that at the bottom option on the poll there. Also unpacking in a bit more detail what CDI is about, how that measures and monitors critically and benchmarks. I think this is super exciting. In terms of like benchmarking your approach to consumer duty and measuring your culture. I think it's a game changer in the marketplace there. And obviously our colleagues at Ocorian, I think that outcomes monitoring is got to be in the regulators, crosshairs there. And so please do reach out to them for advice and consultancy and support on that, and also on financial crime. I better do that, otherwise Mark will never guest appear on any of our webinars again. It's 2 minutes after the hour, and I'm frankly aware and painfully aware that I rarely come into land at the given hour. So thank you very much indeed for your time. Thank you very much. If we are not able to answer your questions thereafter, and we'll take those offline if we can do. Yes, you will get a copy of the slides. You will get a copy of the slides as well. But thank you so much indeed to Adrian. Thank you to you, Mark, and also to you, Michael, and to you, the audience, making it our most highest ranking and highest numbering webinar of the year.
Oh. Yeah. Are we the first webinar of the year?
Yes,
Philip. There you go. Statistics. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Pleasure.
Take care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.